The year was 793. Dawn broke over the windswept island of Lindisfarne, its stone monastery standing like a beacon of Christian faith against the North Sea's endless gray horizon. Inside those sacred walls, monks began their morning prayers, their voices echoing through corridors that had known only peace for generations. They had no idea that death was sailing toward them across the dark waters. By sunset, their blood would stain the altar stones, their screams would pierce the morning silence, and the women who had devoted their lives to God would face horrors that chroniclers would struggle to record. What you're about to discover isn't just another story about Viking raids. It's the buried truth about what happened when Norse warriors turned their attention to the most vulnerable targets in medieval Europe. Christian nuns, locked away in remote convents, supposedly protected by their sacred vows and the sanctity of their calling. The reality was far darker than any monastery wall could hide. This isn't speculation. This was targeted warfare designed to destroy not just bodies, but souls. To understand why Vikings specifically hunted Christian women, you need to grasp how these attacks fit into a larger campaign of psychological terror that would reshape medieval Europe forever. The traditional narrative tells us that Vikings were simply raiders seeking gold and silver. Brutal, yes, but ultimately motivated by material gain. That narrative is incomplete. When Norse longships began appearing off the coasts of Britain in the late 8th century, they weren't just hunting treasure, they were hunting symbols. Christian monasteries and convents represented everything the pagan North despised about the spreading influence of the Roman Church. These weren't random targets of opportunity, they were carefully chosen objectives in a war between two incompatible worldviews. Medieval chroniclers understood this immediately. Alcuin of York, the greatest scholar of his age, didn't describe the attack on Lindisfarne as simple piracy. He called it an apocalyptic sign, evidence that God himself had withdrawn his protection from the faithful. But Alcuin's letters reveal something else, something that church authorities worked carefully to obscure in later centuries. The attacks weren't confined to male monasteries. Women's convents suffered identical assaults, and the fate of their inhabitants was recorded with chilling precision by those who witnessed the aftermath. Between 793 and 870, at least 41 convents across Britain were completely destroyed by Viking raiders. 41 communities of women who had taken sacred vows, who lived in isolation specifically to avoid the violent world outside their walls. By the time Norman armies conquered England in 1066, only 9 houses for women remained in all of Britain. The mathematics are stark. More than 80% of England's female religious communities vanished during the Viking Age. These weren't casualties of war. They were systematic targets. The evidence comes from sources that medieval authorities couldn't suppress entirely. Legal documents recording property transfers after convents were abandoned. Archaeological excavations revealing burn layers and hastily buried treasures. Most damning of all, the chronicles kept by surviving monks who recorded what they witnessed when they returned to devastated religious sites. Their accounts describe scenes that challenge everything we think we know about medieval warfare. What happened at Whitby Abbey in 867 provides the clearest picture. This wasn't just a monastery. It was a double house, home to both monks and nuns under the authority of an abbess. When Danish raiders led by Ingvar and Ubba stormed its walls, they didn't simply loot and leave. They systematically destroyed everything that made the place sacred. Buildings were burned, relics were desecrated, and the fate of the religious community was recorded with brutal honesty by chroniclers who found the ruins months later. The women suffered specific torments that chroniclers struggled to describe in acceptable language. Medieval Latin contains euphemisms that modern scholars have only recently decoded. What emerges from these coded descriptions is evidence of systematic sexual violence designed not just to terrorize individuals, but to pollute the sacred spaces themselves. In the medieval Christian mind, the rape of consecrated women didn't just violate their bodies. It defiled the very ground they had sanctified through their vows. This wasn't random violence born from the heat of battle. This was calculated desecration. planned with the same precision Vikings applied to navigating treacherous seas. The choice of targets reveals a sophisticated understanding of Christian psychology that contradicts every assumption about barbarian simplicity. Norse raiders didn't just stumble upon these convents during coastal raids. They sought them out deliberately, guided by intelligence networks that mapped the religious landscape of Britain with military precision. The evidence lies buried in the administrative records that survived the chaos. Property deeds transferring convent lands to secular lords after communities disappeared. Tax rolls that suddenly list former religious sites as abandoned holdings. Most revealing of all, the witness statements preserved in episcopal archives, testimonies given by traumatized survivors who escaped the destruction and made their way to distant monasteries seeking sanctuary. Sister Elgafu of Hartlepool left an account that church authorities immediately classified as too dangerous for circulation. Her testimony, discovered in Durham Cathedral's archives in 1847, describes the systematic methodology Vikings employed when attacking women's religious communities. The raiders arrived before dawn, surrounding the convent to prevent escape. They didn't burst through the gates in a frenzy of bloodlust. They waited. They watched. They studied the daily routines of the women inside, identifying the abbess, the senior nuns, the novices who might prove most useful as captives. When they finally attacked, every action served a dual purpose: physical conquest paired with spiritual defilement. The chapel was the first target, not because it contained the most valuable treasures, but because its desecration would break the psychological resistance of the entire community. Sacred vessels were used for profane purposes that witnesses couldn't bring themselves to describe directly. Altar stones were defiled with substances that rendered them permanently unusable for Christian worship. The communion wine was mixed with blood drawn from the nuns themselves, creating a blasphemous parody of the Eucharist. But the systematic nature of these attacks becomes clearest when examining what happened to the women afterward. Unlike male monasteries where monks might be killed outright or ransomed back to their families, convents faced a different calculation. Consecrated women held value that extended far beyond their potential for manual labor or political leverage. Their violation served as propaganda, proof that the Christian God could not protect even his most devoted servants. The slave markets of Dublin and York developed specialized trade networks for trafficking religious women. Byzantine merchants paid premium prices for Christian nuns, not for their labor potential, but for their symbolic value in a world where religious identity determined political allegiance. A violated nun represented the ultimate trophy of conquest, living proof that pagan warriors could penetrate the most sacred spaces of Christendom. The chroniclers were right to bury these records. The truth they documented was too calculated, too systematic, too revealing of human capacity for weaponizing faith itself. For over 1,000 years, we accepted the sanitized version where Vikings were simple raiders motivated by gold and glory. But the evidence scattered across medieval archives tells a darker story. This was psychological warfare perfected, targeting the symbols that held medieval society together. The 41 destroyed convents weren't just casualties of the Viking Age. They were proof that no sanctuary, no matter how sacred, could survive when faith became a battlefield and bodies became the currency of conquest.